Hello, and welcome to part 4 of Barley Snyder's vaccine webinar series, The Impact of the COVID-19 Vaccines on Higher Education. We will allow a couple of minutes for everyone to join the webinar, and we'll begin shortly. Please note, this is a webinar platform, so we cannot see or hear you. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
All right, Elise, we about ready to get going?
Go ahead, Dave.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation regarding the impact of the COVID-19 vaccines on the higher education system. My name is Dave Friedman. I am a partner with Barley Snyder's Employment Law Group and Education Law Group. I'm the chair of the Education Law Group, and I am resident out of our firm's office in Lancaster. I'm very excited to be here on today's presentation. I'm very excited to have three most excellent colleagues of mine on the webinar with me today. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about Martin Siegel. Marty is counsel for our firm and a resident in our York office. He is a member of our real estate and environmental groups. He is chair of Barley Snyder's COVID-19 response team. Marty has over 20 years experience as a litigator for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. He's worked in private practice for many years, including at Barley Snyder. And before all that, he obtained his master's degree in public health at Johns Hopkins University. He also held government positions with the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, as we hear about a lot with respect to the COVID-19 crisis. He also held a position at the Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest Laboratory. It's a great honor to have Marty joining us for today's presentation. Thanks, Marty.
Thank you, Dave.
You're welcome, sir. Along with Marty, we're going to have Sarah Yerger on the presentation today. Sarah is counsel with our firm in our resident in our Harrisburg office. She is a member of our employment and education law groups. She has over 25 years experience counseling and litigating on behalf of employers in state and federal courts. She spent 13 years as an employment and civil rights litigator in the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the warm welcome.
You're welcome. And, you know, it is a presentation about higher education. So we thought it probably would be good to get someone who's a little closer to the higher education experience as a student than Sarah or Marty or myself. And so we've got Caitlin Rohrbaugh here on the call today. Caitlin is a associate in our firm's York office. She is a 2020 grad of the Thomas R. Klein Drexel University Law School. She was a Rising Advocate Scholarship winner and the articles editor at the Drexel law review. She passed the bar this year under the most trying of circumstances. The bar is never easy, but this year was particularly difficult due to the COVID-19 crisis. And she is now a member of our firm's litigation and higher education group. Welcome aboard, Kate.
Thanks, David.
You're welcome. All right, so here's how things are going to work with this presentation. We're going to have Marty give everyone an update about the vaccine itself, where we stand with regard to the rollout. Then we're going to talk to Sarah about some of the employment law related issues that are relevant to the COVID-19 vaccine. And then we're going to finish up with Kate telling us some of the student issues that institutions of higher education are facing or could face with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. But before we get started, of course, we're a law firm, so we have to give you our disclaimer. The information in this presentation is for general informational purposes only. It should not be construed as legal advice or a substitute for legal counsel. The views expressed in this presentation are those of each individual presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of Barley Snyder or the views of the other presenters. If you have questions about your situation or about how to apply information contained in this presentation to your situation, you should contact an attorney. We assume no responsibility for the accuracy or timeliness of any information provided in this presentation or any of the linked sites. As information changes rapidly, users are strongly advised to verify any information before relying upon it. So with that being said, I want to bring Marty in. Marty, tell us, where do things stand with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine rollout?
Well, thanks, Dave. First, I need to know, as Dave had mentioned, this is the fourth in a 5-part series we were doing on vaccine impacts. And I have to say that I've been involved in each one so far, and each week I have had to update my slides. This is an area that is rapidly changing on what is getting approved, where we are in the vaccine process, where we are in the priority scheme for people getting vaccines. So as I go through this, I'd like to emphasize that this is a snapshot for today. It may change tomorrow. It frequently changes from day to day. So stay posted. Follow the CDC and the State Department of Health websites. Follow our website. We frequently will do updates. So again, my job here is to set the framework. Many of you may have already seen this or read about this, but let's make sure we try to make sure everybody is on the same page. What we do to get a vaccine approved to go into shots, that go into people's arms, there is a CDC advisory committee on immunization practices that will review prioritization recommendations for who can get the vaccine or who should get the vaccine in what order. The vaccines that are out there now are being administered pursuant to an FDA, Food and Drug Administration, emergency use authorization, as opposed to the regular type authorizations where vaccines are fully approved after typically a multi-year process. States also submit plans to CDC on how they will administer their vaccine program. And what we need to emphasize is that states, not the federal government, has the direct regulatory authority of who gets vaccines, when vaccines may or may not be mandatory. And quite frequently, and right now, as is in Pennsylvania, state plans may differ from the CDC recommendations on how they want to prioritize their population for getting the vaccines. Okay. Right now, we have 2 approved vaccines for COVID-19, Pfizer and Moderna. Each of these vaccines require 2 shots, typically 3 to 4 weeks apart to get the full immunization. Unlike many past vaccines, these are incredibly effective, 90 to 95% effectiveness in preventing the disease. There are several vaccines in the pipeline, AstraZeneca in particular, and Johnson & Johnson. We expect that There will be applications to FDA soon, probably by the end of the month or in February for these vaccines. It seems that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is next in line. And one of the big advantages for the Johnson & Johnson shot is it requires only one shot to get full protection. And again, there are at least a dozen other pharmaceutical companies working on vaccines. So there will be others in the pipeline, which will have a dramatic effect, hopefully, on increasing the supply. Now, I am not going to read the next three slides in their entirety, but this is to give you an idea of where we are in the prioritization scheme for getting the vaccines in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is in phase 1 and primarily directed at long-term healthcare facility residents and healthcare workers. Pennsylvania has included in its phase 1 people older than 65 and also people between 16 and 64 who have a number of high-risk conditions. Phase 1B tend to be people in other congregate settings, first responders, and workers in a number of industries that are deemed to be important to the functioning of the economy. I will note for the purposes of this webinar that education workers are in phase 1B. Stay tuned. Follow the State Department of Health websites about when the state is moving into 1B and start signing up and scheduling appointments if you can. Next phase is 1C. Again, these will be essential workers in multiple vital sectors that are out there, and you can see the list right here. I will note that these slides will be provided email to everybody participating in this webinar, so you do not have to write all these down. But again, this is the phase 1C. And then the next phase, phase 2, will be everybody else that has not been covered in those first 3 phases. There is not a timeline for when these things are going to be happening. It largely depends upon the supply of the vaccine and an infrastructure to deliver the vaccine.
Marty, if I could just butt in here for a moment. There has been a question that has come in about whether Pennsylvania considers faculty and staff at colleges and universities to be part of the education worker population. And I would think that that is correct, right? That they when they refer to education workers, that would include everyone who would work at, say, an institution of higher education, right?
I would agree. Like many guidances coming out of the Department of Health, oftentimes lacks specific clarity on what is covered in all of this. I would tend to interpret education services as what it says. It does not exclude higher education. It is not limited K through 12. And I think that will be good enough that when you get to that phase 1B, you show up, you have an appointment. I don't think anybody's going to turn anybody working at a university away.
Okay, good.
Okay, there again, this has been in the news frequently. When we first started these webinars back in December, a lot of the obstacles I was listing were potential obstacles. Since that time, unfortunately, some of them have turned into actual obstacles to delivery of the vaccine. I will note that in the healthcare business, there is a saying that vaccinations do not prevent disease. Vaccines don't prevent disease, vaccinations do. It is important that once you have this vaccine, it gets into the arms of everybody in the population. Okay, again, I will not spend a lot of time on these, but there are a number of potential obstacles. Supply chain shortages. The industry needs a number of things to make the vaccines and deliver the vaccines, everything from chemicals to test tubes. And some of in the industry have in fact encountered some shortages in the supply chain. There are plans I am reading in the new administration to implement the Defense Procurement Act to perhaps direct more into the supply chain to address that. Frequently, what happens with any manufacturer of vaccines, particularly new vaccines, there may be bad batches from the manufacturer. These are quality controlled, they are checked frequently, and oftentimes entire batches of vaccine from a manufacturer have to be discarded. There are logistical breakdowns, particularly the Pfizer vaccine needs to be kept in deep freeze beyond your typical kitchen freezer to stay good. That means that those have to be in place and obviously makes it very difficult to deliver to rural and underserved communities. There is a big obstacle to overcome. Our country has a significant anti-vaxxer community out there that are suspicious of any vaccines. There's the added perception that the COVID vaccines have been rushed and therefore may not be safe. So it's a matter of convincing people that these have undergone vigorous monitoring and all evidence points to their safety. More obstacles. As I said, the obstacles that are out, or the vaccines that are out right now, require a second vaccine. It is difficult enough to get people to come in for one vaccine, let alone a second vaccine, particularly if people get some side effects from the vaccine. A noted side effects is often people after the vaccine, the next day, they may have some general malaise, they may have a headache or a slight fever. And if people experience that, they may not have a lot of incentive to go back for that second vaccine. So there is a significant effort to get people back for that second vaccine. Unexpected adverse reactions. Again, there's been large clinical studies on these vaccines, but when people started to get the Pfizer vaccine in the United Kingdom, they noted that some people who had a history of allergies were getting some severe allergic reactions. That was not known, but it is expected to get unexpected adverse reactions as we go through these, and hopefully they're being monitored. There will be an inevitable backlash from perceived or actual adverse effects. And again, what I learned in public health school, in epidemiology, correlation is not necessarily causation. I will guarantee you that there will be people within a week of getting the COVID vaccine will probably die or get COVID or have something else bad happen to them. They may get hit by a truck, but this happens, particularly when you're starting off with a vaccine in an older, otherwise frail population. People, unfortunately, die all the time, and it is probably and unlikely to be related to the vaccine. But those cases will be hyped, and it will be an obstacle and an education project to get people to understand what are real reactions to a vaccine and what are just things that happen all the time in life. The last obstacle I want to point out is there is getting to be a real roadblock to getting those vaccines in people's arms, and it's just finding enough medical personnel who can actually give the shots. In many areas, the nurses, the doctors are already pretty busy treating COVID patients. There's not a lot of slack in the system. It's hard to find people who are licensed and able and trained to give these shots. And that's been a significant obstacle that has been developing and is out there. Is there may be vaccines sitting in the refrigerator, but you don't have the medical personnel to deliver them. So these are things all to be aware of.
Well, it sounds like, Marty, there are just generally speaking, some obstacles with respect to the vaccine that we've gotten to a number of different vaccines developed in record time, but there are obviously a lot of logistical things. There are matters of public perception that we have to worry about, and we have some challenges ahead of us. So I thank you for bringing all of our attendees up to speed about that. We're going to transition here and talk to Sarah Yerger for a bit about issues facing employers. And Sarah, what kind of obstacles are employers facing with respect to COVID-19 vaccination?
Right. Excuse me. So one of the questions that we're getting from our clients is who's going to pay for this? And health plans will cover the full cost of the vaccine if it's an approved vaccine by the CDC. So that's one of the big obstacles always is money. And we also want to make note that employers can offer incentives to have their employees get the vaccine, like having clinics for them, or even having, bonuses or remuneration for actually getting the vaccine. I'm going to talk a little bit later about workers' comp implications, but I want to be clear here that if you encourage strongly your employees to get the vaccine, that it becomes practically a mandate, and then something happens because of the vaccine, you could have workers' comp problems. And I'll talk about that towards the end. But if it's purely a voluntary program, it's not a problem, and it may be to your benefit to demonstrate a safe working environment under OSHA, as well as a demonstration of goodwill to your educational community. Another question, actually, if you would go back one, another question that I and my colleagues in the employment group have been getting is, can employers, and for our purposes today, institutions of higher education, mandate the vaccine? OSHA's general duty clause requires employers to provide a safe working environment for employees. And traditionally, vaccines in the workplace have been considered medical examinations under the ADA. So in order to mandate the vaccine as a condition of employment, employers have to show that it's job related, consistent with business necessity, justified by direct threat, and no broader than necessary.
And just that, Sarah, if I could just interrupt, the ADA you're referring to there is the Americans with Disabilities Act, correct?
Yes, I am. Thank you. And it's easy to establish for employees who have this this test is easy to establish for employees who have direct patient care responsibilities, but that's not the case for institutions of higher learning. The farther away we get from direct patient care, the harder it is to justify. So, next slide. The EEOC on December 16th came out with some guidance that's applicable to all employers. And they clarified that this issue by saying that the mandatory vaccine is not a medical exam if administered to employee by employer for protection against contracting COVID-19. In fact, the quote from the EEOC's guidance is, employers are no longer seeking information about an individual's impairments or health status. So the EEOC is saying that employers are permitted to require vaccines as a condition of employment. If you have remote workers, that's probably not a viable option though. But COVID-19 vaccinations would require pre-screening information, and that would be necessary to determine whether the employee could be vaccinated or whether a certain vaccine would be contraindicated. That disclosure is what triggers the Americans with Disabilities Act provision prohibiting disability-related inquiries. So if employer administers the vaccines themselves, they must show that it's job-related and consistent with business necessity and no broader than necessary. So the EEOC suggests that employers have third-party administrators handle everything with respect to the vaccine, and really all the employer would get is proof that the vaccination happened. But we highly recommend that you be careful here. Employers shouldn't be asking questions about why an employee did not receive the vaccination, because that could lead you down an ADA implication path that you don't want to go down. Next slide. So the rest of my time, I'm going to be talking about mandatory vaccinations and giving you a feel for what we think best practices will be. As Marty discussed, the EUA, or the emergency use authorization, drug companies have sought emergency use authorization. They completely bypass the full FDA approval. Here's the rub as it concerns mandating the vaccine. The EUA provision specifically states that individuals who get the vaccine should be given the option to accept or refuse administration of the product under emergency use. So just relying on EUA, there is a problem with mandating. Need to get that out there, but the reality is the time frame in which most of us will be able to be vaccinated, we probably won't be like operating under the emergency use authorization anymore. So if you mandate the vaccine, there are some exemptions that you should be aware of. First, the ADA. As many of you know, the ADA defines disability broadly, and it prohibits discrimination against otherwise qualified disabled employees, requires a reasonable accommodation of disabled employees, unless doing so would impose an undue burden on employers' operations. So the ADA requires good faith interactive process. As employers, you should require medical documentation, the basis for refusing the vaccine based on disability, and you need to evaluate the medical necessity of that request. You don't need to excuse an employee from vaccine if allowing the excuse would be a direct threat, but you need to provide alternate accommodations such as remote work or job transfer. And then finally, as with all medical inquiries and accommodation information, it should be kept in a separate file.
So Sarah, does that sort of mean that when we're in the world of a mandated vaccination by an employer, that the employer would approach these ADA reasonable accommodation issues in the way that they would approach any kind of disability related accommodation issue in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. You would do that same interactive process. So if you mandate vaccine as a condition of employment, you'll have to accommodate individuals with a disability that makes the vaccine contraindicated or dangerous. We recommend establishing a process in advance for evaluating these requests. You don't have to take the employee's word for it, or even the word of the employee's treating physician that they're not able to get the vaccine. You may want to contract with an external medical officer to evaluate the exemption request, and of course, always follow the CDC guidelines. So the other major exemption is under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and this is on the basis of a sincerely held religious belief. This is because the prohibition against religious discrimination under Title VII allows for the review of a sincerely held religious belief. As with the ADA, accommodation is not required if it is an undue burden on the employer's operations. So what constitutes religion? EEOC and case law have said that all aspects of religious observance, practice, and beliefs need to be considered. This includes traditional organized religion, but also beliefs that are new or uncommon and not part of a formal church or sector, or those that may just be believed by a small number of people. So keep in mind that a practice or belief may still be religious, though, even if the employee is affiliated with a group that doesn't believe it. Religion includes moral or ethical beliefs about what is right or wrong, but social, political, economic beliefs are not religious. Marty referenced the anti-vax community. Anti-vax beliefs are political. However, if anti-vax beliefs are a portion of a broader faith-based belief, then it could be religious. And that's where it comes in, where there needs to be an evaluation of whether it is a sincerely held religious belief.
And that quote up there, Sarah, that is from a U.S. Court of Appeals case back from 2017, where the Federal Appeals Court tackled that issue. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals is the U.S. Court of Appeals that embraces Pennsylvania, correct?
Correct. And yeah, this is a great quote that solidifies, where our guidance today for everyone is coming from. So, what can we use to evaluate whether an employee has a sincerely held religious belief? there are a couple factors that you can look to. You can look to their vaccination history. So if an employee has gotten every other vaccine, for example, the flu vaccine, then it might put into question whether they have a sincerely held religious belief about which would prevent them from getting the COVID vaccine. Also look to other inconsistent behavior, suspicious timing, like all of a sudden when the COVID vaccine is available, they start to practice their religious belief. And it's all, in terms of social media, it is okay to do research on social media. And the research you would look for is are there political bases or other bases that are not religious for this person's belief? For example, are they an anti-vaxxer on Facebook?
That type of research, though, should probably be conducted by an HR person who understands and is sort of removed from the day-to-day management of the employee, correct?
Absolutely. Just like it would be in any other employment situation, it would be the HR person. Keep in mind that it's not relevant whether employers' sincerely held religious beliefs are, in quotes, correct. Whether you believe them or not, it's about the person and whether they are sincerely held.
And that kind of plays into what you were saying before with respect to that there are, if somebody has beliefs that are not necessarily in line with their religious tradition, maybe not officially adopted by the church that they go to, but that nonetheless, employers are still allowed to evaluate whether those employees actually sincerely hold those religious beliefs, regardless of whether they are correct religious beliefs about the safety of the vaccine or whether they align with the supposed religious tradition that the employee is following, right?
Right. In fact, not only are they allowed to, but we recommend that they do that because that would just provide you protection from any kind of lawsuit. So yes. So in terms of the policy for evaluating sincerity, we recommend a policy where you set out the requirements for the exemptions, require the employee to describe their religious belief and why they need an exemption. Again, use a third party familiar with the religious beliefs of the employee. It doesn't have to be a religious leader, but it can be. Allow employees to give documents like books or other materials which show that their belief is sincerely held. And set firm deadlines in your policy that give employee notice about when they need to report information. So set deadlines. And consider the use of an outside evaluator. Again, this is insulating the employer because you're getting information that's being investigated and considered by someone else other than the employer. But in the end, the employer always has to retain that decision-making authority.
Yeah, and Sarah, I would just add that all of these recommendations that you're making are excellent and are derived from the limited case law that we have out there with respect to mandatory vaccinations and religious accommodations under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Thank you. So we're going to do a little quiz, a polling quiz. So everyone get ready. Let me read this for you. Professor Rippey works at Barley University as a philosophy teacher. Barley University mandates the COVID-19 vaccine for all faculty and classified staff. Professor Rippey requests a religious exemption and asks to wear a mask and other PPE while on campus. Professor Rippey submits a document describing his religious beliefs. Although he does not belong to a religious organization, he has strong personal and medical objections to the vaccine. He explains that one should not harm their own body and that the vaccine may do more harm than good. He cites to the Nuremberg Code, a set of research ethics principles for human experimentation created at the end of World War II, and claims the vaccine violates his rights under this code. He further alleges that getting the vaccine would violate his conscience as to right and wrong. Professor Rippey made a strong showing of a sincerely held religious belief? Do, 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 do.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Give it a couple more minutes here, or a couple more seconds. All right, can we have? So 77% of you said no and 23% said yes. Well, in my opinion, the no's have it. And here's why. The Nuremberg Code is not a religion. It's very popular with anti-vaxxers. It's all over the internet with them. And this language should raise red flags. But as I noted before, Professor Rippey may still have a sincerely held religious belief, but it shouldn't be based on the Nuremberg Code alone. Again, that's a political, it's not a religious foundational belief. So I told you to put a pin in this workers' comp issue and want to come back to it. So what if there are complications with the vaccine after you've mandated it? The Workers' Comp Act covers an injury occurring in the course and scope of employment. And so medical complications, whether temporary or permanent, resulting from the vaccine would be considered a work-related injury if it's mandated, or if it was so strongly encouraged that it actually was a mandate. So another reason to make it voluntary, but still encourage employees to participate. To be safe from a workers' comp claim, you can put in the policy that this is voluntary and not a condition of employment. But I have to say, you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't, because making it mandatory could protect you from an employee's COVID-19 claim. In any event, you should consult with your workers' comp carrier before mandating the vaccine. So my favorite section, because I do a lot of labor law, the anti-vax movement is really one in which a group of people get together to talk about and assert what they believe is their right to discuss these kinds of issues. When those group of people are your employers or your employees, and you take any action against them, you could find yourself in a Section 7 unfair labor practice problem. So Section 7 says that employees' right to protest allegedly unsafe work rules, and we're assuming that an unsafe work rule would be being forced to take the vaccine. And this applies, again, to both unionized and not unionized. Section 7 applies to almost all employers, whether you have a union or not. So if employees were to band together to protest mandatory vaccinations, such actions could constitute protected concerted activity under Section 7 and insulate those protecting employees from allegedly retaliatory actions such as termination for refusing to be vaccinated. So be careful if there is a situation where you have employees that are clearly coming together to complain.
Sarah, quick question. Does that Section 7 rule apply to both non-management personnel and management employees, or is it limited in one way or another?
It is limited. It applies to non-management level employees. Section 7 doesn't protect the rights of those who are making the decisions for the employer.
But it's not always clear who those employees are. So if employers are dealing with something that could implicate Section 7, they should probably be reaching out to their counsel to get that advice on who is and who is not in management and who is not covered by these Section 7 protections, right?
Yeah, we would recommend that they reach out, particularly in the higher education field, because different schools have different ways of saying of leveling out. Is a dean at the top, or is it just the very heads, the registrars, or the
and a department
president
chair or something like that? Especially when you're dealing with faculty issues, those can be pretty sticky.
Yeah. And then if anyone on the line does have are unionized, the mandatory vaccination program is considered a mandatory subject of bargaining, and it can't be unilaterally implemented. The exception is if your collective bargaining agreement contains language that reserves sufficient employer discretion to implement health-related work rules under the what we call the management rights clause. But even then, the employer's unionized workplace would still likely be required. You'd still have to do effects bargaining, which basically is an opportunity to sit down and talk about how the vaccine will affect the employees. So if you have a contract and you're not sure if your management rights clause covers whether you can mandate, then please reach out and talk to a counsel about that. And what happens if you do violate this? Well, you find yourself being investigated by the federal government under an unfair labor practice claim. So, best practices. What we believe you should be doing is laying the groundwork now. Adopt a written policy and communicate that policy to your employees. And we also believe that the very tops of businesses and institutions should be rolling up their sleeves and getting the shot themselves. And that's part of the messaging that needs to be sent. And also minimize the political distraction. Focus on immunity, focus on the positive messaging. And then finally, be proactive. Prepare for possible litigation and discuss with counsel any issues that you think could lead to litigation.
Well, that's great, Sarah. I agree completely that we're talking about a workplace safety issue here, not a political issue. And hopefully we can start to depoliticize some of these issues that have arisen related to the COVID-19 crisis. So now I want to thank you for that, Sarah, and bring on Caitlin to talk a little bit about students. And Caitlin, tell us how are students feeling about this? I mean, we heard from Sarah that, and Marty made reference to it too, that there is some sort of anxiety out there about the COVID-19 vaccine. Are students willing to, roll up their sleeves and get the vaccine put in their arms, or are students pushing back a little bit on this, as far as we can tell from public opinion polls?
Yeah, so great question. As David mentioned earlier, I am a recent graduate. So I actually graduated in the midst of this lovely pandemic. All of my finals were remote. We didn't have a graduation. My bar exam was completely remote. So I definitely am understanding the struggle of everything that those in higher education are going through right now. So student distrust of the vaccine is one of the major factors that higher education institutions are going to be running into right now, and should be something that's being talked about when you're discussing and implementing any type of policy around the vaccine. So the young adult age group, which these studies are considering ages 18 to 29, actually make up the age grouping that's least concerned about COVID in general. So, when comparing to the older age groupings, the 18 to 29-year-olds are, oh, I'm not going to get COVID, I'm not worried about it, or they just don't think it's as big of a deal as the media and the news is making it out to be. And because of that, they're actually amongst the group that's the lowest likely to get the vaccine. So this is obviously a red flag for major higher education institutions, because this is the age group that is at your campus. And this is definitely something you're going to want to be thinking about. So even though, it makes sense that if the distrust is high and they're least likely to get the vaccine, they're actually amongst the highest number of diagnosed cases in Pennsylvania. So all of these things wrapped up together makes them a prime age group for the higher education institutions to be focusing on and educating and making sure that we are pushing to get these students vaccinated.
But our folks here on the call are educators, so I feel that they are more than up to the task to address that.
Yeah, I believe so. So when we're looking at this subset of the 18 to 29 age group, we're also wanting to focus on the age group who make up those in the African American community as well. historically, the African American community has actually been taken advantage of in the medical field, and that has led to a growing distrust amongst them of medicine within their community. So we think it's important to flag and recognize that their history does exist, and it's important for them to be educated as well and help them to trust the process of the medicine and the vaccine in any way that you possibly can. So Sarah talked about this a little bit in terms of employees, and I just wanted to hit historically the mandated vaccine for students. So many of you pose this question, are we required or can we mandate that students get this vaccine? So the Touchstone Supreme Court case that's relevant to education in general is Jacobson v. Massachusetts. And in this case, long story short, the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts actually adopted a smallpox vaccination requirement, and everyone residing in the city was required to get the vaccination. And the Supreme Court of the United States actually held that the city's ability to mandate the vaccine was a valid exercise of their police power, which is given to them under the US Constitution. And they did so as a reasonable regulation of public health. So there, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania was basically saying, we support this mandated vaccine and we think it's a big deal. And we think that there should be fines imposed if people are not following through with this vaccine. And then about 17 years later, the Supreme Court again reaffirmed this stance in Zucht v. King. So in this case, in San Antonio, Texas, there was an ordinance that provided that no child or other person shall attend a public school or other place of education without having first presented a certificate of vaccination. So here the court upheld this ordinance and stated that states may delegate health regulations to local municipalities, and then those health regulations may include mandatory vaccination for school attendance. Obviously, this is a huge deal because not only in Jacobson were they saying, yeah, you can fine people for not getting a vaccine, they were actually saying you can take students out of education for not getting vaccines. So this really emphasizes the support that the Supreme Court has put behind mandatory vaccinations. And then Pennsylvania actually has a statute that requires students, this is K through 12 public school students, to be immunized. And then Section 84 of that code, as Sarah kind of alluded to earlier, does have exemptions for medical, religious, and actually philosophical as well. So specifically, students are not required to be immunized if a physician provides a written statement that immunization could be detrimental to the health of students, nor are they required to be immunized if the parent, guardian, or the emancipated child themselves objects to the immunization on religious grounds or on the basis of a strong moral or ethical conviction similar to a religious belief. So like I said, although this is specifically for K through 12 public students, it does show that willingness and the support from Pennsylvania to provide for a mandatory vaccination where circumstances seem to compel that public safety aspect to be there. And we think that this is very informative for higher education institutions who are kind of worried about that, will the state support or can we legally mandate a vaccination? And then we're going to jump over and focus on higher education for a minute. So there actually is a mandatory vaccination act that we've seen amongst higher education institutions called the College and University Student Vaccination Act. So this act actually requires students who are staying in dorms or any type of university housing to be vaccinated for meningococcal disease specifically. So this is one instance where the court or the state has said, yes, we want to mandate a vaccine for a certain subset of these higher education institutions, which is an option that you can consider.
Now, has the state weighed in yet with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine, either providing any kind of guidance to institutions of higher education about whether they're permitted or even required to require students to undergo vaccination and under what circumstances?
Yeah, good question. There definitely hasn't been much guidance. There has been no indication that they're going to require that higher education institutions mandate a vaccine. I believe PA has even taken the stance of PA will not require the vaccine. So they're really giving leeway to higher education institutions to create their own policies that work for their community when determining whether they want to either require vaccinations or require them for a smaller subset of their community.
So is the recommendation then for those institutions that if they that they decide to ultimately, once the emergency use authorization issue is resolved, if they decide to mandate the vaccine, that they should provide a system similar to what Sarah talked about with respect to employers for medical and exemptions for sincerely held religious beliefs?
I think that, yes, I think that there would be some type of policy that would need to be implemented and would need to be implemented proportionately throughout the higher education community.
Excellent.
So obviously the goal of mandatory vaccination is this herd immunity that we've all been hearing thrown around as we talk about this vaccination coming out. So herd immunity means that most of a population is immune to an infectious disease, and it provides an indirect protection then for those who are not immune to the disease. So that is that emphasis on those small subset of people who are exempt from the vaccines. This herd immunity still is applicable, even if we have not 100% of our community vaccinated. So for example, even if 80% of the population is immune to a virus, then 4 out of every 5 people who they encounter with the disease won't get sick or they won't spread the virus further, which is the goal. So the percentage of people who need to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity actually depends on the disease. It fluctuates anywhere between 50 to 90% of the population. Obviously, herd immunity is incredibly important for higher education institutions, especially with students, because we have hundreds and thousands of people crowded onto this campus, and they're living, they're eating, they're going to classes, attending events, working out, they're doing all of this together. So herd immunity could be very, very effective for higher education institutions on campus. And we've actually seen it be very effective in other infectious disease cases that were once common in the US and are rare now, like measles, mumps, polio, chickenpox, meningococcal disease, all of those we've seen herd immunity be very effective. And then obtaining herd immunity by requiring the vaccination could obviously lead to normal operations returning to campus, which is everyone's goal. Unfortunately, not in time for my graduation, but it's fine. So, masks and social distancing could become a thing of the past, but, and I emphasize this, but it's important to understand that the immunity is not automatic. We're not yet aware of how quickly a person will be immune following the vaccination. So even after vaccination, COVID protocols should, still be followed until we can be more certain about how quickly this immunity works. And like I said earlier, herd immunity doesn't require everyone to be immunized, but it's important to set up those guidelines around the exceptions, because if too many people are exempted, then we don't get herd immunity, and then the effectiveness that we're going for is not going to be there.
So for the time being, until we get to that herd immunity level, it's more mask wearing, more social distancing, and washing our hands till they're bleeding. I really love this slide here, Kate, based on what we were talking about setting the example and depoliticizing the issues. You see up there, we've got Republican Vice President Mike Pence and Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris, both rolling up their sleeves, leading by example and getting the vaccination. So excellent point to draw.
How timely that picture would be for today.
Yeah, exactly. No kidding, right?
So then obviously we talked about the benefits. Now we're going to jump over to the hurdles. Marty and Sarah did cover these. So obviously the supply is going to be an issue. Right now, we don't have the supply to mandate a vaccination for an entire campus community. So that's something that you guys are going to want to consider. If you're attempting to give the vaccinations on campus, administration of those and having enough staff may be a problem and something you want to consider. And then obviously the storage, those Pfizer vaccines require that deep freezer that some institutions just may not have access to. So these things we discussed are all things that you're going to want to talk about when you're implementing policies and vaccinations. And then we also jumped down into this uncharted territory, mandatory vaccination, and specifically giving those vaccinations on campus probably isn't something that many of us are used to or many of you have had to deal with yet. So we do recommend reaching out to your insurance providers and discussing those policies with them to ensure that you're protected in the event that you decide to mandate or you decide to give those vaccinations on campus. In the event that anything goes wrong, you know that you're covered. Obviously, one downside to the COVID vaccine is that it's new and we don't have much information about its side effects. And this often deters the mandatory vaccination label because institutions are nervous about requiring a vaccine that we don't know the long-term side effects yet. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, it's important to determine if you will give exemptions and which exemptions you will allow and create strict policies around their execution, because disproportionate application of those exemptions could actually lead to legal liability, which we don't want you to go through. So we do suggest going over your policies with your counsel and, being proactive and stepping through the policy and trying to pick out where those legal implications could pop up and kind of plan for that litigation in the future.
Yeah, it would seem to me that under the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act, that there would be, if you're going to have a mandated vaccination policy for students, that there would have to be religious and medical exemptions to be made, because that's going to be required to comply with the prohibitions against discrimination because of disability and sincerely held religious beliefs under the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. The philosophical exemptions, that's where things get a little bit less clear. I personally don't think that is something that is required, at least under the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. But it is something that institutions might want to consider as a student relations matter. But do they want to be telling people that we're going to disregard your philosophical deeply held philosophical beliefs, or are they going to accommodate them as these students are becoming adults and they have agency over their own bodies? So I think they're going to have to the extent institutions want to do that, they're going to have to develop policies and a process to match it up with their religious and medical exemptions and have the same kind of rigor applied to those. And, they're going to have to ask themselves whether the, benefits of providing that agency to students is outweighed by the harm that can be caused by a deadly virus being spread about the campus. Even if students aren't getting sick, it could make older employees deathly, fatally sick, and members of the community as well.
Definitely. And I think that goes back to that issue of herd immunity and that with the religion and the medical being such touchstones in our society, that philosophical is really where the wiggle room is. Well,
colleges certainly don't, they obviously have employees, they obviously have students, but they do a lot of other things, colleges, right? I mean, you've got events on campus for speakers, you've got athletics, you've got concerts, you've got cultural events. They're almost like hospitality venues as well. What kind of issues does that raise for institutions of higher education?
Yes, so we definitely cannot talk much about this, but we did want to bring it up. Mandating your community vaccine obviously may not cover all of those other individuals that are coming onto your campus. So we do think that you should consider some type of policy around visitors. So either requiring that visitors get vaccines, or maybe a waiver or release of visitors who are attending the campus for events. And then obviously we think you should consider, when you're making those policies, the availability still of the vaccination, and then your ability to follow other COVID protocols while doing those other vaccination requirements.
And of course, as always, consult with your legal counsel. So what are colleges and universities doing right now, or what should they be doing?
So first and foremost, we think right now internal and external communications about the vaccine and those policies should be happening around things like how to best encourage the vaccine or educate about the vaccine. We kind of recommend using influential members of your community, sports teams, student government, the president, prominent professors in the community, and then considering if you're going to mandate the vaccine and who you're going to mandate the vaccine for, whether it's going to be everyone, certain subsets of the grouping, and then consider maybe if you're not mandating the vaccine, whether you want to incentivize the vaccine. Like Sarah mentioned, we've been seeing some type of monetary incentives that may not work for institutions of higher education, but maybe other types of incentives will work better, at least in terms of students. So you could consider that. And then if you're mandating or incentivizing, we think it's important to consider whether you're going to offer free on-campus vaccinations, since we know that ease of access is probably one of the driving forces for getting students vaccinated because of both money and distance, lack of cars and all of that. So Your Sinus College has actually applied to become a closed point of dispensing the vaccine at their campus. So that means that they actually applied to be a vaccination site for their community only and are not going to be dispensing to the outside population. So that's another thing that you could consider if you don't want the outside population coming in for vaccinations. But first and foremost, we think education around the vaccine is huge, and getting as much truthful information out there as possible will be helpful, because we know all of the misinformation that's swirling around right now. And just keeping an open chain of communication with your community so that they feel informed about the next steps that are happening. And then just to briefly breeze over these best practice tips, Sarah has already covered a lot of them, and I've already mentioned all of them. But choosing influential figures, creating a policy that works for your community, the open line of communication, and just gathering resources and knowing what works for you and what's best, and then just continuing precautions for now and being proactive with your insurance and your counsel.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of the presenters here this afternoon. You, Kate, Sarah, Marty had to jump off the call and get on another call with the Maryland state legislature. I had to throw that in there just, whenever I like to brag about my colleagues. We have gone a few minutes over, but I want to thank you all attendees for your patience with us. And I also want to thank you on behalf of all of my Barley Snyder colleagues for what you're doing out there. These are probably the most trying times that any of us have ever worked on. And I just can't imagine how you could have an industry that is more trying than institutions of higher education trying to operate in this type of environment. You all are working more than minor miracles every day, and you have a lot to be proud of. I know you don't get a lot of positive feedback, so I wanted to give you that, because I do know what some of the colleges are doing out there and how they're reaching out to their students in ways that they never have done before and in more creative ways. So you all have a lot to be proud of in that regard. As we conclude here, I want to make sure that everyone knows that we are going to be emailing out this PowerPoint to everyone. I think someone mentioned that earlier, but just to reiterate that point. So you'll get all this stuff. Our contact information is obviously on that. If you have any questions or concerns about developing vaccination policies for COVID-19 for your workforce, for your students, for the public at large, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We all have experience developing those for clients. I also want to remind everyone that this is part of a series of presentations that Barley Snyder attorneys are giving regarding industry-specific guidance regarding COVID-19 vaccine rollout. The next one up is the logistics industry, and we'll be having a presentation on that on January 26th from 1 to 2 p.m. You can get information about that by signing up for our newsletters and updates, which are available. You can sign up on our website. I also wanted to put in a little plug, if I could right now, about the Barley Snyder Legal Update podcast. We are in our second season of the podcast, and we have an episode coming up soon that is going to be very interesting listening, I believe, having to do with the immigration law changes coming under the Biden administration. We're going to have one of our new Barley Snyder attorneys, Lauren Berkowitz, minutes breaking that down for us. And of course, the Barley Snyder Legal Update podcast is hosted by the greatest podcast hoster in the history of the world, which would be none other than yours truly. If I don't say so myself. But so pay attention to your social media feeds for information about that. And again, go to our website if you'd like to get some of our updates. We do have a very active COVID-19 response team that is churning out these updates as directions are coming down, whether they're from the Pennsylvania Department of Health, the Pennsylvania Department of Education, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. We've got our finger on the pulse of all those things. Thank you very much, everyone, for presenting. And that concludes our presentation today. Stay well, folks. Peace.